So my name's Sarah, and clues in the title, I run Sarah Jones Coaching. I've been doing that for 7 years, and imposter syndrome is a topic that comes up in most conversations, whether I'm mentoring, coaching, or giving presentations. In fact, I was giving a speech yesterday to some fleet managers in the area of transportation and logistics, and again, imposter syndrome came up. So that's our topic today, and we'll share all the resources afterwards. Moving the slides on, takes a bit of time. There we go. So I've put 2 numbers on the screen, and I'm wondering if you could think to yourselves what those numbers could possibly represent. So just have to think about that for a minute. What they actually mean is that 70% of executives, that's of any level in any organisation at any time, will suffer or feel like an imposter, like they have imposter syndrome each year. So that's 70%. That's quite a high number. And as I mentioned, it does come up very, very often in coaching between, senior leaders, the middle managers that I coach, people setting up their own business. And that 84% number is actually about business owners that feel that they are imposters. So it does come up for business owners as well, because sometimes making that leap from a corporate environment to running your own business feels very, very different. So as you can see, there's some significant numbers there. So I want to share with you that if you have ever felt that you potentially have imposter syndrome, don't worry, because it's something you can work with. I'll go on to those techniques later, but actually it's very, very common, and people don't always like to talk about it. That's the beauty of coaching, because it's just me and my client. It's all confidential, and it does come out in conversation. So it's something that is very, very common. So before we get started, I'll just share a bit of my story. Some of you may know this already, but I've been running my coaching business for about 7 years now. I provide coaching and training. As I mentioned, imposter syndrome came up even yesterday in a talk I was giving around fleet management and how to manage upwards. It comes to us in all different guises, and I'll explain why it comes up and what we can do about it. My previous career for about 25 years was working in corporate environments. So I worked for large organisations. I worked for the NHS, I worked for DHL, and for many other leading organisations, as you can see here. And my career was in the area of government affairs, corporate communications, financial communications. And I think I was lucky enough to be born quite a resilient, tenacious person. Maybe it's about being the first of 4 children in my family, but quite resilient, quite tenacious. But I did have an experience of imposter syndrome myself. So, for example, I remember that when I was first promoted to being what I would call a leader for the first time, I had no training, no development. All we had, was the internet to research. There weren't the training programs, or coaching wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So I definitely felt a bit of a fraud, as in, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here. What does leadership actually mean? So I did have that experience, but I kind of dealt with that because I enjoy a challenge. So I ran with it, and I sought my own support and help through that. That's not the same for everybody. And I just want to say it can be incredibly lonely and isolating as a leader. And sometimes we don't want to talk to people internally about what's going on with us, which is where coaching and mentoring really can play a big part in helping you. The area where I did see it emerge was when I moved into the NHS, because my experience had been private sector, working in a very dynamic, low margin industry, working very quickly, managing teams all over the world, working hybrid before hybrid was a thing that it is today. But when I moved into the NHS, the culture was very different. I was working in that middle area of the NHS, so I wasn't frontline. And I firmly believe that in large, complex organisations, there can be a pervasive culture, but there are many different cultures around different departments or workings of a large organisation. But certainly when I joined the NHS, I was conscious that it was my first time in a public sector role. And I remember feeling quite uncomfortable at that time. And I sort of battled with that myself and work my way through it. I didn't even know or had even heard of what imposter syndrome was at that time, but I definitely recognise that that is what I was experiencing at the time. So I can definitely empathise if you've been through it and how it feels. Okay, thank you for those that are just joining. So today I'm going to cover a few topics. Well, what do we mean by imposter syndrome? Where did it come from? How has it become such a prevalent word in our vocabulary today? Why we experience it? And also, what are the different types of imposter syndrome? Because there's more than one. And sometimes it's important to know and recognize which one are you. There are different types that were sort of diagnosed, if you like, by a leading professor that was studying this area of imposter syndrome. And then we'll look at it and think, hang on a minute, this can feel quite scary, but can imposter syndrome be a friend as well as a foe? And then I'm going to give you some techniques that will help you manage your way and work your way through imposter syndrome, which, if you saw the first slide, it covers about 70% of people working in business each year and 84% of business owners. So that's what we're going to cover today. A little bit of history. Imposter syndrome was first coined as a phrase, as a thing, if you like, in about the 1970s by some psychologists. And it's really grown and grown since then in terms of how it's been studied and why it comes about, which I'll go on to in a minute. So it is something that has been around for a very long time. I'll give you a couple of examples because I'd already mentioned that I do work with a lot of clients on this. Male, female, people starting up their own businesses, experienced managers who perhaps have broadened their role or the organisation has restructured, people that are first-time leaders, women that are in leadership as well, somebody that has moved or as a result of a restructure been given authority to lead a team, but actually doesn't really know a lot about the subject area. So yesterday I was talking to somebody who, as I mentioned, I was at the Fleet Management Summit yesterday speaking, and one of the gentlemen there explained, well, I've been given fleet management, but I'm in procurement. So feeling a little bit out of his depth there. So we talked through some techniques for him. So it's been around for a long time. It has been studied. And as part of that, I'll go into the different types of imposter syndrome that we have. I've seen it a lot as well when I worked with a client. He'd been through a number of restructures. Countless restructures in an organisation which was in healthcare, and I think a bit world weary about the numbers of restructures that he'd been through. And one of the cases that I saw with him was because he was moving into the new structure and didn't know what the new world would look like, that dented his confidence. And I do think confidence and imposter syndrome go hand in hand. So he felt very below par. I could see it in his body language, his face, etc. And what I realized was that his identity had been so aligned to the company as it previously was before the restructure, before the bringing in of other companies. He felt that he didn't belong. So that was quite an interesting conversation to identify the cause behind that imposter syndrome, because it's not always one thing. I think we grossly simplify it if we say, well, it's this, it's that. It can be a very personal, unique experience. So that's just an example of somebody that I helped through that. And that was really about making sure that he understood himself as a leader, his own leadership profile, his personal dynamics, to understand, well, this is who I am, and this is how I can adapt to the restructure. So I know restructuring's been happening a lot this year, and maybe that's something that you've experienced. Just before I go into this, again, working with a lady that was leading an HR team for the first time, and in her upbringing, and some of this does relate to our upbringing, she had come from a very large, loud family, a very boisterous family, and that was fine. But then her role in the family was to actually be quiet, because she couldn't really get her you know, her voice heard. So she sort of almost consciously took a role in sitting back a bit and being a bit more quiet and playing a different kind of role in the family dynamics, which we all do, by the way, as I'm sure you know. But then that didn't really work when she was moving into an HR role, an HR leadership role, where she would have to present, where she would have to present in front of very senior leaders, the board, for example. So I just remember her saying to me, all of the things that are on these slides, as in, I don't really feel I deserve this role. I'm not sure it's really right for me, almost talking herself out of it. And all of these questions that you see here, as in, oh, is this really the right role for me? How am I ever going to be a successful leader if I can't speak up? That's just not who I am. So there were lots of these questions and more going through her mind. And we had to work together over a series of sessions to build her confidence and find a way that she could authentically be herself, because none of the work that I do, I don't want to change people's characters. Yes, we might smooth off a few edges. We all need those to look at the blind spots, but really looking at what's right with you, what strengths can we build upon? And in that instance, we found a way for her to carry herself with gravitas and influence, and to communicate in an authentic way. So not copying what other people were doing, but I know for a sort of quite a bit of time, she was feeling a fraud. She was nervous about this new role. So some of these questions and more do come front of mind, and maybe you've experienced them yourself, as in, it's only a matter of time before I get found out. I only got this job because nobody else wanted it, or because of a restructure. This is a fluke, this is an accident, I'm winging it, I don't really know what I'm doing. So anything like that that sounds like self-doubt, a drop of confidence, an excessive use of negative self-talk can be a very clear sign of imposter syndrome, and it can be quite a pervasive feeling. The other thing I want to add is that I think imposter syndrome sounds like really scary. It sounds as though it's a condition, and of course it is an experience that we have as human beings, but sometimes all of us will have imposter thoughts. Those imposter thoughts can be fleeting moments or episodes where we feel, oh, I've got to give a presentation to the biggest audience I've ever done, I'm not sure I'm really up to this, you know. So that confidence, lack of self-belief, and imposter syndrome can go hand in hand. So having your own self-belief and confidence and working on that in many different ways is really important. But we can get those fleeting moments of imposter syndrome, or imposter thoughts, I like to call it, because syndrome sometimes sounds as though you might have it forever. Now, some people, it does take longer to work their way through imposter syndrome, and it can be more pervasive. But for some of us, it might be in the same way that we might have a moment of an anxious thought or some anxious thoughts. That doesn't always mean that we're permanently anxious or that we have a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. Same with imposter syndrome. We may just have fleeting thoughts or a moment in time where we feel as though we're on the edge, we're going to get found out. So it's really worth thinking about it in those couple of ways. But I would always recommend that you talk to someone about it if it is building up in your mind, because we don't want that to build up into something that affects you personally and professionally. And this actually can occur, of course, in personal lives. I've spoken to professional men and women who have become, they're sort of still senior managers and directors, or they're still running a successful career. Maybe they've had paternity leave or maternity leave, or one of them has not been working for a while. And actually entering back into that workspace can be quite tricky and can lead to those thoughts of feeling like an imposter, as in, well, I was good then, but am I still good now? So we have to look at a couple of things, our external successes, but the internal view is really important. So we have to be able to build up our self-belief, and I'll share a couple of tools with you about that in due course. So these are just some of the thoughts that you might recognize, and there are more. Now, I wanted to go into what I mentioned earlier about, well, why do we get this? Why does this happen? And some of you may have seen this before. This is the Kubler-Ross curve. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross designed this change model, this change curve, and she's written a book about it, probably several books, but I've read her main book on this, and it actually relates to grief, like traditional grief, if you like. But then it was broadened out to help us understand that we do have an emotional response to change. And sometimes I think we can barely see the ends of our own noses, you know, and that's not designed to be critical. It just means that sometimes we're so inside of our minds, inside of our thoughts, and perhaps in our roles, we don't have a lot of support. We don't feel comfortable opening up to people, that when we go through these changes, we can go through these different feelings, and people go through these feelings in terms of, over time, we might start off with shock in terms of, oh, something's happened. We might go into denial, a bit of frustration. Depression can sometimes happen. Hopefully it doesn't get to that point. This is just a model, but also we then move into, perhaps as we get to that bottom bit, experimenting, engaging with a new situation, our new role, and making a decision about, well, I'm going to help work in this new situation, this new role, this amended identity of myself that I need to have in my new role, my identity as a leader perhaps, or a team leader. And then we integrate those changes and move on. So this is typical for everyone, and I think it's really a critical model for us to understand, because sometimes during change we can see reactions in our team members that we don't quite understand, and particularly linked to their DISC or insights profiles, where it's so important to understand our team's personality types, or your personality type, your psychometric profile, because then we understand our strengths, our weaknesses, and where we tend to go under stress. So the reason why I'm explaining this is, number one, it's really important for you to understand it, for you and your team, and to help manage yourself, get some help, or manage your team through it. Otherwise, we end up in a washing machine going around that first bit. So I did a webinar on change last month, and if you'd like a recording, let me know, because I did go through actually how to get out of some of those washing machines, as I call it, of emotions that we can't move from. But this is very closely linked to imposter syndrome, because it tends to happen when we are on the cusp of something new or different. So when we are at a turning point in our career, and that could be anything in our career, and also, of course, our personal life, because our human brains tend to recognize that something's different, something's changed, and we're wired for safety. As human beings, we love safety. We want to feel safe in our professional environments. So that's why leading your team in a very conscious, forward-thinking way is so important, and understanding your team and helping them feel a part of changes, because, you know, there are so many changes these days in business, and to help them, as I said, move past those emotions. But there's so many changes, and to help your team through is very important, to help yourself through, because we will experience these imposter thoughts or imposter syndrome. So it tends to happen, as I said, when there's change. And as I mentioned, we don't like change being done to us, generally speaking, as human beings. And unfortunately, our brains are typically wired for survival. So, excuse me, sorry, I was just going to click someone in, admitting, there we go, welcome. Our brains are wired for survival. So we have a bit of a negativity bias in our minds. So without even thinking, and we all do it, you know, it's not as though you can do one training course and get rid of all of your biases. They'll always be there. But as human beings, we lean towards negativity bias, and that can be on a very subconscious level. As you raise your self-awareness through coaching, understanding how to adapt, then that does improve, obviously. And when you improve your internal filter, you find your external results improve. So we have this negativity bias about, oh, what's going to happen? I'm under threat here. You might not be using those words. It might be a feeling. And being able to understand that is very, very important, because what studies have shown that, in fact, despite this negativity bias, despite the hundreds of thousands of thoughts we have each day, very few of them actually come true. I can't remember the exact number, but it's about 85% of what we fear doesn't actually come true. And I think if we take a forward, conscious approach to dealing with our emotions, our feelings, and these changes, we can really help ourselves, our team, our organisation, and our families as well. Because if we're not happy professionally, we tend to be not happy personally. So it happens during change of career, change of a new role. I was working with someone recently in a pharmaceutical company, and he was feeling quite dejected, really, because there'd been a huge amount of structural change, and he'd lost his confidence as a leader because some of his team members had left. But having looked at the reviews and the data, he took that very personally as someone that likes to drive and succeed and push forward. But when we looked at it, it was actually about other things. So again, that 84% of the stuff he was worrying about wasn't true. But as humans, we can't help but pay attention to how we're feeling. And it's important to do so, but it's important to be able to look at how we're feeling. So he was feeling very much like an imposter because his role had broadened. Team members had left, his role had broadened, and he was now reporting up to the board. And he didn't feel that he had the elements, the team around him to succeed. He felt that he was very self-conscious because it was the first time he was exposed at this level. So it can be that change of role, restructuring, going back to work. Perhaps if you've been made redundant before, which is highly common in this volatile, uncertain world, perhaps you've had those feelings before when you've been striving for a new position or going for a new position. So it's very common, and it usually comes around change. And in a way, even though it feels frightening or a bit debilitating sometimes, we can embrace it. We can use this as an opportunity to reflect on our style and reflect on other elements of our professional life and personal life. And I'll come on to that in a minute. I also want to share with you something that I teach my clients, that we very often label these thoughts, these feelings as good or bad. As humans, we like that certainty. It's either good or it's bad. And life doesn't really work like that in that very binary fashion. Life tends to be a little bit like this. So it's a bit of a wavy line that can go up and down. And that's why I teach a lot of resilience and resiliency skills, because resilience is a very, very, if not, studies have shown, the most important skill and attribute that we can have in today's world. So we label emotions, it's either good or it's bad. However, what we can do is try and neutralize that a bit. And if we are able to look, as I have done with my clients, to say, hang on a minute, let's not go into flight, fright, flee, all of those tendencies we have as human beings to avoid a problem. Let's look at them face on, and let's consider that this feeling is a piece of information. How you feel internally is a piece of data. It's a piece of information that you can then start to interrogate. So you could write down, for example, or keep a note. Well, what is this? How would I describe what I'm going through in a couple of sentences? And again, this is the beauty of coaching, because by articulating that to a coach, we can then express what we often suppress. So we suppress, but then we express to really allow that to grow, to be developed, to be looked at. So feelings as information. What am I feeling? Where do I think this comes from? And this isn't about self-judgment. it isn't about self-blame. It's actually about self-reflection. And I would always recommend you bake in time. I know it's really busy, but I don't know if you have an opportunity, even if it's for 5 or 10 minutes a day, for quiet self-reflection, particularly if you're going through imposter thoughts or potentially syndrome at this point, to think about, okay, this is a piece of information and I can use this information to help me. What is this information telling me? What is the message that is behind this feeling, this piece of information? What is there something, is there something I need to learn, grow, develop? So ask yourself questions or speak to a mentor or somebody that can help you work through that, because very often we are running around meetings, this, that, and the other, trying to juggle all of our priorities. And that means a lot of what we actually need to be aware of gets very suppressed. It's like layer upon layer upon layer. So that quiet time to reflect on that and really neutralize that feeling. And studies have shown that if you do spend time doing that self-reflection and even writing down a few notes, can be on your iPhone or however you like to do it, it actually activates the part of our brain that is more about finding creative solutions. That's why coaching works so well, because it's a two-way interaction. It accesses that part of our brain which is around decision making, resources. So really giving yourself an opportunity to think about, well, hang on a minute, this is a piece of information. What is it telling me? What do I need to learn? So that's a really, really good starting point. So really face it head on. Sometimes, as I mentioned, we build things up in our mind to be bigger than they actually are. So there we go, at times of change and processing that information. So there are different types of imposter syndrome. So I suspect that's made your day. But anyway, there's more than one. And I just thought this is really interesting. This is from a professor, Professor Young, from back in 2011. And again, I'll send the slides around so you can have a look at some of the speech bubbles. But there are several types of imposters. There are those imposters who are perfectionists. And again, perfectionism does come up a lot in my coaching sessions. There is one called the natural genius. There is the rugged individualist, or sometimes I like to call them the soloist or the soul trader. Soul trading, that was a word I used to use in my corporate career. The expert and the superhero. And again, none of this is about blame. It's just about self-awareness. And if we're leaders or managing a team, we need to grow our level of self-awareness. And that is the hallmark of conscious, forward-thinking leadership in a world today that is changing beyond belief. So let's look at this. The perfectionist. Someone that needs to do everything perfectly, as it may suggest, that has to go to the nth degree of detail. And we know from studies and work on the Pareto principle that 80% of our productivity and results come from 20% of the effort. So it's not always the case that if you spend, I don't know, like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours on a presentation when you're only speaking for 10 minutes, that is absolutely necessary. Perhaps you're somebody that likes to demand that of yourself and your team and set yourself really high standards that others might find difficult to meet and follow, and you might actually find quite difficult to meet and follow. And sometimes I've seen it with my clients where they will be working extra long hours, taking on other people's work, not delegating. That can be a sign of perfectionism. So that's definitely one of the signs of imposter syndrome. The two maybe go hand in hand. Then you've got the natural genius. I mean, I don't know about you, but I remember there was a lad at school who was the natural genius. Everything came so easily to him. Any subject, just naturally very bright, didn't have to revise too much for his exams until it didn't, until he went somewhere else to college, and that no longer worked. And sometimes for people that have had that experience of things coming up until now very easily without having to put in too much effort that you just feel it's fine, they've got this, moving into something which then requires a bit more of a digging deep process or a bit more effort. I'm not saying they don't put in effort, but generally the natural genius things just seem to come easily, or something happens in their life that they weren't expecting. They were very treasured in a company, high profile, and then something there changed. That can be very difficult for someone that's a natural genius and appears to have flown through life. Then you've got the rugged individualist. The rugged individualist is somebody that's sometimes called the soloist, the sole trader, that doesn't ask for help, that likes to solve all their own problems. So that's somebody, again, that can suffer with imposter syndrome of this variety, that they are always solving their own problems and don't really ask for help. Perhaps they might be, if they're leading a team, perhaps micromanaging people or not delegating again. So the individualist, as it suggests, will want to do a lot of things on their own. Then we have the expert who has to be the expert on everything. And again, please don't take this as self-blame. It's just reflection to play with and sort of have a look and think, well, hang on a minute. Am I one of those? Am I two of those? Oh, I do that. Maybe when that doesn't happen for me, when I'm no longer the expert, I feel out of my depth. Remember what I said about change. And therefore, my facade of being the expert really drops. And that's why I feel an imposter. I feel out of my depth. So the expert, bing, 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 rather like the gentleman I was talking about at the summit I was speaking at yesterday, was given a functional team for an area that he knows nothing about. And he just said, Sarah, I just feel out of my depth. I feel like an imposter. So we talked through a few areas there because he's an expert in procurement, etc. But then being given another function on top of that can be something that's quite daunting and lead to those thoughts of, I'm not sure what I'm doing. So the expert is another one. And then we've got the superhero. The superhero is somebody that likes to pick up, as the name suggests. Their identity is very fixed in fixing problems, fixing this, fixing that. And sometimes and I've seen a lot of that in logistics and supply chain, which can be a very, very fast industry, and it changes specifically in the fulfillment end. A lot of fluidity, a lot of pace, fix. And then sometimes when somebody that is the superhero or acts as the superhero puts on that facade, that persona, when they move into a different role, which is about leadership and management, that feels very, very strange indeed, as in, I'm not fixing like I used to. This doesn't feel like me, rather than really embracing and stepping into leadership, which is a mindset, but it is obviously a skill set that we have to learn. Sorry, I'm just trying to admit someone in. There we go. So the superhero, that can make you feel really out of sorts. So when you switch from these personas that you may or may not be aware of that you have, that can really have an impact and lead to that imposter syndrome, because it's a change, something feels different, but perhaps you can't put your finger on it. So there are a number of different imposter syndromes. And sometimes it's worth looking at family dynamics. Perhaps in your family, you were looking after younger siblings, for example, and that led you to be the superhero. Or perhaps you had a career in the military. I've seen this with veterans, where it's very much, sometimes can be very fast, bang, 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 pace, fixing problems. And then moving into that management role can be very, very different, because as we move up through management and leadership, I know there's all sorts of different teams and sectors, but it's much more about people and managing upwards, results people, rather than actually doing the job that you were doing before. And that tends to be quite a big leap, and where I see imposter syndrome cropping up a lot. So here we go, try and see if you can identify something from your past or something that you're doing at the moment that lends itself to one of these types, or potentially a blend of types. So, friend or foe? Well, I think I've given you a couple of clues already that I do believe that imposter syndrome, it feels like a foe, it feels like the enemy, it can feel intrusive, and I don't want to belittle it because different people experience it to different degrees. We can have those thoughts that sort of come and go related to a particular activity, or it can go on for a bit longer. And that's where I think really seeking the help of a coach, a mentor, an understanding boss can really help you. I think the ability to discuss your own individual situation is really, really important. So I've talked about how it can be a friend in a way, how you can try and embrace the information that this feeling gives you. So there's a great quote here, which some of you may have heard before, around what you resist persists, what you accept transforms. When we fight against something, it's like trying to swim upstream against the current. You know, you're fighting, you're pushing, you're resisting. And all that does is create more resistance, more stress, more stress. If you can imagine swimming in a river against the current, your body's working hard, your mind's working hard, it's just pure resistance. Whereas if you go with the flow a bit more, then you can transform. And by going with the flow, it means asking these questions and looking at what you can do to help yourself. So there's a number of ways in which you can help yourself, which I'll come on to in a minute. But I want you to understand that by speaking to someone, by working through it, by understanding where it comes from, this is really the key step to transforming imposter syndrome. And then beyond that, there's unlimited techniques to help you in your unique personal situation, or the situation you may have with one of your team members that seems to have suddenly lost a bit of confidence, or you're noticing a change in behavior. So we have to really embrace the struggle sometimes. And that's part of being a very forward-thinking, conscious leader, and embracing that. And in fact, conscious leaders who are very self-aware, above the line, that means being self-aware of your interactions, what's going on with you, or just asking yourself the right questions, tend to be more successful, retain more talent in their teams, and have a much higher level of success in their professional lives. Because when you go through something like this, it's an opportunity to grow. When we go to the gym, for example, we do exercises that stretch and tear our muscles, but then those muscles repair and then become stronger. And imposter syndrome can be a bit like this, if I can use the gym analogy. So have a look at, what do I need to change or do differently? If it's happening within your team, then I would definitely look at how you can support them. Or sometimes team members don't like to talk about what's going on for them internally to someone within their organization, even if it is an organizational coach. So maybe in that instance, some external help will happen. In fact, I've just had a conversation this morning about that very thing, where the organization, it's a large organization in technology. They recognize, well, we've got these training courses and we've got some information, some self-learning on imposter syndrome, etc. But we need something specific for a certain cohort of people, some more specific feedback and support for them. So make sure your team, if you are leading a team, have got somebody to talk to, and try not to label people. And goes without saying, it's not a very conscious thing to project onto somebody else what you think it is. Allow them to talk, listen, ask questions, and get them the help that they need. And development plans are really important, of course. The other thing you can do is a skills audit. Now, I use DISC psychometric profiling, and it's fantastic because if you're a leader or a manager, it looks at 3 key buckets of information: vision, alignment, execution. And typically when we're working through a strategy as leaders, we have those 3 buckets of vision, alignment, execution. And it measures you according to the most successful leaders in the world today. And it's been based on decades and decades of research and today's modern leadership trends. So that gives you really good information about, hang on a minute, there's some skills here as a leader I specifically need to develop. And what I often find, and I don't know, it seems to be quite prevalent in the UK in certain industries, is that we're very good at doing things, we're very good at the execution, but when it comes to building that vision and getting alignment around it, those seem to be the areas where we fall down. And actually, if you are a leader and feeling isolated about that, then I do a whole bunch of work around how you can create a culture where you don't feel like that, where you have that support, where you can use your team to support you. So get in touch if that's something you are struggling with. So psychometric profiling, DISC, invaluable. I love it because my clients read it and very often say, that's why I do that. Okay, I understand that now. And it's just about reflection and building awareness. So that really, really helps. And then from that, looking at a skills audit, maybe have a look at, okay, what are my strengths? And I can tell you that most people, when I ask them in a coaching session and we're working through something like imposter syndrome, will tell me what your key skills are. What do you think are your key skills? Very often people will say, well, I've never been asked that before. That's a good question. I don't know. But the more that we notice our strengths, the more that we notice our strengths. It's like a rolling stone gathering moss. So start to look at your skills. What do I do really well presently? What gets me in the flow where my job feels quite effortless, you know? So have a skills audit. Make sure you really understand your key skills and keep building upon that list over time. And then maybe have a look at, okay, right, where are the areas of development? You know, I don't like to talk about weaknesses because we're all good at some things, perhaps less predicated towards doing other things. So have a look at, well, are there some key areas that I need to develop? Or if I'm leading a team, is it a key area that I maybe need to delegate to somebody else instead of being the superhero, as I referred to before, or the sole trader? So those are some of the things that you can look at immediately, and processing those feelings, asking those questions, doing a skills audit, getting some help, doing the psychometric profiling around personal mastery, which I do in DISC, and the work of leaders report, and making sure that if there are some signals there around, this is a new role, okay, something feels new, it's a change, I'm feeling uncomfortable. Right, I really need to then be the pilot, not the passenger of my own career, and look at, okay, I need some training on this. I need to speak to somebody on this. If I'm the soloist or I've always been the expert, 100%, the hallmark of good leadership, one of the hallmarks, is being able to ask questions. And actually, I'd go so far as employing people that are better at some of the areas of your role than you are. And that's certainly what I used to do, because we need to let go of the fact that we know everything there is to know. We need to let go of that ego a bit. So what is your own personal development plan? Where are those areas you need to develop? And it may well be confidence. It may well be just rebuilding up that confidence. And confidence, I believe, can be situation specific. You can be confident in one area, but perhaps not in another area where it's quite new to you. And that's where skills training and development comes into play. So there's a few areas there where you can really start to build, sort of build upon the information you're getting from that imposter. Count your achievements. Again, as well as the strengths, I want you to remember what you're good at and what you've achieved. Personal life, professional life, it doesn't matter. Just really recognize what's got you here. Even if it is, well, I was made redundant, that wasn't so great, but perhaps that led to something better, as it often does, something better or different that you really wanted to do. So it could be setting up your own business. It could be growing your team. It could be moving to a new sector, but count your achievements and keep a record of that, because again, what we give our attention to grows. And rather like the strengths, count your achievements. Separate feelings from fact. Remember, feelings are information. It doesn't mean they're true. And as I mentioned, about 85% of what we fear doesn't actually come true. Flip the script. Just hear what you're talking. Listen to your inner voice. And that might sound difficult. And sometimes I work with people to help them interrogate that inner voice, because you're hearing something, but you can't put words to it. It's perhaps a feeling. And I work together with my clients to bring that to the surface. When it's at the surface, we can see it instead of fight against it. So really flip that script. Sometimes I say to my clients, when you feel a negative thought, as we call them, coming in, think about it as information. See a little flag waving, like a yellow flag or a yellow card on the football pitch, and go, hang on a minute, that's something that's coming in there. That's a piece of information. What am I saying to myself? Flip the script. Change it from, hey, everything's going to be okay, I'll learn what I need to, using affirmations, flip that internal script and really amplify the positive of what you're doing, amplify what you're doing well, and look at, if you're leading a team, are there areas that are perhaps not best suited to your personality style? Perhaps you're somebody that's great at the big picture strategy, you understand that data is really important, but it's not what you're good at. Well, somebody in your team with the right profile would love to do that. So let's work on the positive bits. Let's really get that balance into play there in our careers and continue to review that negative self-talk. Again, keep a note that accesses our awareness and it allows us to make different choices because we're looking at it in front of us on paper or on our iPhone or our computers. And then recognize, okay, as I mentioned, the development skills that we need to grow. One of the most important things we need to realize as well is that a failure isn't a failure. It's only a failure if we refuse to learn. Now, sometimes in our personal and professional lives, we might need to experience that failure or wrong turn a couple of times. It might take a few times because we're so busy being busy before we realize, hang on a minute, I've been in this situation before. What would I do differently? And even if something hasn't gone quite to plan, and some companies have experienced really successful failures where they thought something had failed, but then it launched into a new product or a service and disrupted the marketplace. So reframe failures and mistakes, call them a misstep, and reflect upon, well, what would I do differently now? And just watch that self-talk. And hopefully you've got a leader that can listen and who is empathetic. And if you have made a mistake, the best thing, own up to it, talk about it, and communicate what you would do differently, because that's how we learn. That's how we learn. So reframe anything that looks like a failure. I've talked about mentoring and coaching. We suppress everything. We suppress so much running around doing our day-to-day work, our day-to-day jobs, running our businesses. So express, don't suppress, because otherwise it's just layer after layer. And that's where coaching, to have someone who's really objective sitting in front of you that isn't going to judge you. Our friends and family are great, but sometimes they give us advice that doesn't quite suit us or isn't, well, that's not really how I'm feeling. So it doesn't feel quite right. So we have to be able to trust ourselves, and coaching and mentoring builds that environment to build this self-awareness, conscious leadership, intentional leadership that I've been talking about throughout the presentation. And then visualization might not be for everybody, but honestly, if you can visualize yourself doing well, athletes do this all the time. They will picture all the different steps, if they're running a race, for example, all the different steps they're taking from, I don't know, getting into the changing room, their routine, what they do, running the race, to how they feel afterwards. So try with some visualization, There's lots of exercises online for that. So just find the one that works for you. But it's really about creating the sensation, the vibration, the feeling of success, because when we do that, we get into a more enlightened, empowering state. And when we do that, things tend to work out better for us because we are emitting that energy rather than hiding ourselves, shrinking and thinking that everything's going to go wrong. So visualization is a really great technique that I would thoroughly recommend, because it's the self-talk and everything really, really important, but it's actually the feeling we need to get into, that feeling, and really working with that visually as well, because our brains believe what we tell them and our brains believe what we see. So if I say red car, you've probably all thought of a red car. So that's how powerful our minds are. So let's work with them and paint a good picture, a good story. So that's given a few tips today about imposter syndrome. I've covered what it is, the different types, how you can embrace it rather than run away from it, where it tends to happen, how it tends to happen. I've shared a few case studies along the way, and we've identified it's really, really common, and there's more than one form of imposter. So what I wanted to introduce today is that I do have 2 monthly masterminds. I do work with organisations and I work with individuals across bespoke programming that identifies your specific needs. for a certain amount of time, or perhaps spending a day together if you need to resolve something quickly. But I'm also launching 2 monthly masterminds. The details you can see here. And it's a really great opportunity to be around people that are in a similar position to you and share in complete confidence what's going on for you. And I'll be there to guide you. We will choose the topics we want to cover. Everybody has a say. There's a private group, and it's really about coming together and using the collective mind to solve problems and different experiences from different sectors, from different organizations, all completely confidential. I'm running one on aspiring conscious leadership, which talks about a lot of the things I've talked about today, about being a forward-thinking leader rather than reacting. And then I'm also doing one for women in leadership. So there's content in there that you won't get anywhere else. There's further discounts on coaching. I've had a lot of interest already, particularly for the conscious leadership one. So I need to follow up with many of those people and carry on with building the community. But it's a really good way, just an hour and a half, you'll get the resources afterwards, of engaging with people that might be in a similar situation, because I do understand that leadership can feel very lonely. But again, if you visit my website, my details are here, then you can find lots of resources on there and details of how I like to work and how my clients like me to work with them. But if you have a specific challenge or a specific situation, you need some help with imposter syndrome, or anything else that I've talked about in previous webinars, such as burnout, stress, dealing with change, then please do get in touch. I've left my details here, and I'm just having a look at the chat. And sorry, it's taken me a bit of time to get to the questions, but I just wanted to get through them. Let's have a look. Time after time. Yeah, sometimes if you're experiencing repeat imposter syndrome, that's takes a bit of digging. It will get easier if you find out what is the cause of the imposter syndrome, what's behind it. Is there something in your background or your family upbringing or something that's happened? We do dig into that. You know, sometimes we have to look in the rear view mirror, adjust the rear view mirror in the car, for example, to move forward. So sometimes we do need to look at those things and understand, well, what exactly is happening for me here. If it's repeating, it might signify it's less the imposter thoughts, more of the syndrome, and perhaps it started happening at some point in your life and never really went away. Perhaps it happened when you were younger. But the good news is, once we start to break it down, then absolutely we can work through that. So I think those are the key questions that I've had so far. If you do want to ask additional questions, then please get in touch with me via LinkedIn or my email address, Sarah-J. All the details are on my website. And again, thank you for listening today. We'll be sharing the recording and some resources for you so that you can refer to this afterwards. And if you or you know anyone else that might benefit from this information, feel free to forward it to them, and I'll be happy to have a confidential conversation. So thank you very much for attending today, and have a good rest of the day, and feel free to get in touch with any other questions or help that I could give you individually or for your organisation. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.